You think you're in charge here? You think that robe gives you power over me? Officer Jason Miller's voice sliced through the courtroom, dripping with arrogance. The atmosphere was suffocating. Every lawyer, witness, and spectator felt the weight of something dangerous brewing. Judge Danielle Carter, a woman who had spent her entire career upholding the law, met his gaze with an icy glare. "Officer, you are out of line. This is my courtroom. If you continue this behavior, I will have you removed." Jason let out a dry, humorless chuckle that sent chills down spines. "Remove me? You really don't get it, do you? This world doesn't work the way you think it does, and I'm done taking orders from people like you." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. People shifted in their seats, some gripping the edges of their chairs, others reaching for their phones, sensing that something was about to take a terrifying turn. Jason took a slow step forward, his heavy boots echoing in the hushed silence. His hand drifted toward his hip. Judge Carter's voice was sharp, unwavering. "I will not warn you again. Stand down." But Jason had no intention of listening. With a single, swift motion, he yanked out his taser. A blinding flash of electricity filled the room, followed by the crackling sound of raw voltage surging through the air. Then, Judge Carter was on the ground. Her body seized violently, frozen by 50,000 volts coursing through her. Her robe twisted as she convulsed, papers scattering from the bench. Gasps morphed into horrified screams. A chair scraped loudly against the floor as the bailiff lunged forward, but Jason didn't flinch. He stood tall, smirking, as the woman who dared to challenge him writhed helplessly before him. "You see that?" His voice boomed over the chaos, dripping with cruelty. "That's what happens when you forget your place." The morning sun cast a golden glow over the city skyline, its light stretching through the towering courthouse windows and reflecting off the polished marble floors. It was the kind of day that felt deceptively calm, where the world outside moved at its usual pace, oblivious to the storm brewing within these walls. Judge Danielle Carter walked with purpose through the grand halls, her heels clicking against the floor, her black robe billowing slightly with each step. Every movement exuded the authority she had spent years earning. At 44, she had presided over some of the most contentious trials in the state, ruling on cases that had sent even the most untouchable men to prison. She was known for being fair but firm, compassionate but unyielding. But with that reputation came challenges, the whispers, the threats, the silent reminders from those who resented her place on the bench. She had long since grown used to the subtle hostility, the sidelong glances, the condescending tones of certain officers who thought she had no right to wield power over them. And one of them was waiting for her in the courtroom today. Officer Jason Miller had been on the force for nearly 15 years. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a presence that commanded attention, he was revered by some as a hero, a decorated officer who had kept the streets clean. But Danielle knew the truth. She had seen the reports, the complaints that had been quietly dismissed, the excessive force allegations that had never made it past internal investigations. The case that had brought them both here today was, on paper, straightforward. A 26-year-old black man, unarmed, had been beaten into unconsciousness during a routine traffic stop, and Jason Miller had been the officer who pinned him down, knee pressed into his neck until he stopped moving. The victim had survived. Barely. But this time, there was no room for denials. A bystander had captured everything on video. The evidence was damning. Jason sat at the defense table with an easy smirk, as if this trial was nothing more than an inconvenience. He lounged in his chair, his body language relaxed, his confidence unshaken. He had walked away from accusations before, and he had no reason to believe today would be any different. Danielle took her seat, leveling him with a gaze that had made lesser men falter. The proceedings began, the attorneys presenting their opening arguments, the evidence being laid out in meticulous detail. Then, the video was played. The brutal footage sent a wave of horror through the room. Gasps filled the air as the audience watched the young man's body go limp under Jason's weight. But Jason didn't react. He didn't flinch. The prosecution delivered their final argument with force, demanding accountability. They made it clear Jason Miller wasn't above the law. And that's when Jason leaned forward, his smirk widening. His voice, dripping with amusement, cut through the heavy silence. "You're wasting your time. You know that, right?" His words weren't directed at the prosecution. His eyes were locked onto Danielle, as if this was a personal battle between them. She didn't flinch. "Officer Miller, you will address this court with the respect it is due." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Respect? That's funny. You walk around here like you own the place, like any of this actually means something." A murmur spread through the courtroom. The prosecutor objected. The defense attorney shifted uncomfortably. The bailiff took a cautious step closer. But Jason wasn't finished. "You sit up there in your little robe, thinking you can tell men like me what to do?" His voice was sharp, taunting. "You don't get it, do you? You never have." Danielle tightened her grip on the gavel, her pulse steady, even as the anger burned in her chest. "Officer Miller, you are out of line. If you continue, I will hold you in contempt." Jason exhaled sharply, shaking his head. And then he smiled. Not a friendly smile, but one that made her stomach tighten. Then he moved. Before anyone could react, before the bailiff could step in, before Danielle could press the emergency button beneath her bench, Jason reached for his taser. And this time, he didn't hesitate. A blinding flash, a violent crackle of electricity. And then, Judge Danielle Carter was on the ground. Her body seized uncontrollably, locked in place by 50,000 volts of raw power. Her robe twisted as she convulsed, her limbs jerking violently, her head snapping back as every muscle in her body betrayed her. Papers scattered from the bench. Gasps turned into horrified screams. A chair scraped loudly against the floor as the bailiff lunged forward, his gun drawn, his voice booming over the chaos. "Drop the taser! Step back now!" But Officer Jason Miller didn't move. He didn't run. He didn't even look surprised. He stood there, smirking, watching as the woman who had dared to challenge him writhed helplessly before him. "You see that?" His voice boomed over the panicked voices, dripping with cruelty. "That's what happens when you forget your place." Danielle's mind fought to process what had just happened, but her body was still locked in the aftermath of the shock. Her fingers twitched involuntarily, her chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged breaths. The pain was unbearable, but her fury burned hotter. This wasn't over. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Lawyers yelled over each other. The bailiff, gun still trained on Miller, barked out orders for backup. Witnesses scrambled back, some running for the exits, others frozen in stunned disbelief. People were shouting, demanding someone do something, to arrest him, to stop him. And still, Jason Miller didn't move. He stood calmly, hands on his belt, like he had just disciplined a child instead of assaulting a sitting judge in her own courtroom. He didn't look worried. He didn't look like a man who had just committed a crime in front of a room full of people. Because he knew exactly how this worked. Men like him got away with things like this. For a moment, just a moment, it seemed like he was right. The next few hours passed in a blur. Reports were filed. Witness statements taken. The police department scrambled to contain the fallout. And then, the video surfaced. Someone had recorded everything. The second it hit the internet, the world exploded. Millions watched in horror as the footage spread like wildfire. Danielle's body convulsing beneath the electric current, the smirk stretching across Miller's face. The outrage was instant. News outlets played the clip on repeat. Protests flooded the streets. The people wanted justice. And yet, somehow, Miller remained untouched. The department placed him on administrative leave, a weak slap on the wrist. No charges, no consequences. For days, the country held its breath, waiting, watching, demanding. And then, something happened. Something no one saw coming. Because karma doesn't send warnings. And when it came for Jason Miller, it came hard. The air inside the hospital room was thick with the sterile scent of antiseptic. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound filling the quiet space. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh, clinical glow over everything, making the white sheets feel even colder against her skin. Judge Danielle Carter lay motionless, her body still weak from the aftershocks of the taser. Her fingers twitched slightly as she tried to move, a frustrating reminder of how little control she had over what had happened to her just hours ago. She had spent her entire career believing in the law, upholding justice, ensuring that the system worked the way it was meant to. And yet, here she was, lying in a hospital bed. Not because she had broken the law, but because she had dared to enforce it against the wrong man. Jason Miller. The name sent a fresh wave of rage through her, her jaw tightening as the moment replayed over and over in her mind. The way he had looked at her, the smirk on his face, the arrogance in his voice as he belittled her in her own courtroom. And then, the taser. The blinding electric snap. The violent way her body had betrayed her, convulsing against the force of 50,000 volts. The shock had been temporary, but the humiliation, the powerlessness, the sheer fury, those were permanent. A sharp knock at the door made her flinch. It creaked open, and Naomi Hayes stepped inside. Even though they had been friends for over a decade, Danielle could see the barely restrained fury in Naomi's eyes. She had been there. She had witnessed everything. She had seen the taser hit. She had watched as Danielle's body crumpled to the ground. Naomi closed the door behind her, arms crossed tightly over her chest. The first words out of her mouth were thick with rage. "Do you know what's happening outside?" Danielle blinked, her voice hoarse as she replied, "I can guess." "No, you can't." Naomi's tone was sharp. "The whole city is on fire. The video is everywhere. People are furious. They're outside the courthouse, outside the police station, outside the mayor's office. Protests are breaking out across the city. And Miller is at home drinking a beer, like he didn't just taser a sitting judge in the middle of a courtroom." Danielle exhaled slowly, pushing herself up against the pillows. Her entire body ached, but she ignored it. "They placed him on administrative leave, didn't they?" Naomi let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Administrative leave? He's getting a vacation while you're lying in a hospital bed." The words stung, but they didn't surprise her. The system had always protected men like Jason Miller. It was the reason he had been so confident, the reason he had dared to do something so outrageous in the first place. He had expected to walk away untouched. Naomi took a step closer, her expression unreadable. "So, what are you going to do about it?" A slow, burning anger rose in Danielle's chest. "You think I'm going to let this go?" Her voice was quiet, but filled with something dangerous. Naomi studied her, then gave a small nod. "Good, because I'm not either." Over the next few days, the firestorm only grew. The video of Jason Miller tasering Judge Danielle Carter had become a national scandal. News anchors debated it. Civil rights organizations called for his immediate arrest. People across the country demanded justice. And yet, despite the public outrage, nothing happened. The police department released a carefully worded statement, calling the incident unfortunate, but assuring the public that an internal investigation was underway. The mayor expressed deep concern, but stopped short of calling for Miller's removal. And Miller? Miller wasn't worried. He gave interviews, sat in front of cameras, twisting the narrative. He made himself the victim, claiming that the courtroom had become a hostile environment, that he had felt threatened, that the situation had escalated beyond his control. And people believed him. Or at least, the people who always believed men like him. Danielle watched it all unfold from the sidelines, her anger growing with each passing moment. She had seen this pattern before. The slow erosion of consequences. The way outrage eventually faded. How men like Jason Miller always seemed to land on their feet, no matter how many lines they crossed. But this time, something was different. The protests didn't stop. The city didn't move on. Tensions reached a breaking point when a group of protesters clashed with riot police outside the courthouse. Tear gas filled the air. Rubber bullets were fired. People screamed. The city was on the brink of something dangerous. And still, Miller walked free. Danielle sat in her office, watching the footage of the protests play on the news. Her grip tightened around the glass of water in her hand. She had never felt this helpless before. She had always believed in the law. But now, for the first time, she felt the bitter taste of its failures. Another knock at the door. She looked up, expecting Naomi. But this time, it wasn't just her. A man stood beside her. Tall, well-dressed. He carried himself with the weight of someone who had seen things most people never would. His expression was unreadable. Naomi spoke first. "Danielle, this is Eric Vaughn. He's a federal prosecutor." Danielle frowned slightly. She didn't know where this was going, but there was something in Naomi's voice, something urgent. Eric took a seat across from her, setting a thick folder on the desk. He slid it toward her. "I need you to look at this." Danielle opened it, scanning the documents inside. Her heartbeat picked up speed as she flipped through the pages. Then, she froze. Her eyes darted back up to Eric, searching his face for confirmation. "This is real?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It is." Danielle swallowed hard, looking back down at the documents. Jason Miller had secrets, more than anyone knew. This wasn't just about what he had done to her. This was bigger, much bigger. And if what she was reading was true, then the man who had humiliated her in front of the entire country, the man who thought he was untouchable, was about to fall in a way that no one saw coming. The courtroom was packed. A sea of faces filled the gallery. Some tense, some eager, all watching, all waiting. The weight of what was happening in this very moment pressed down on the room like a heavy fog. This wasn't just another trial. This was history. At the defense table sat Officer Jason Miller. His back was rigid. His fingers drummed in erratic rhythm against the wooden surface before him. The once confident, untouchable officer now found himself surrounded by walls that no longer worked in his favor. For years, he had believed he was above consequence, above the law, that no matter what he did, the system would always protect him. And yet, here he was, not as the enforcer, but as the accused. The eyes of the courtroom burned into him, and for the first time, he felt something foreign, powerlessness. Across the room, seated with unwavering composure, was Judge Danielle Carter. She was no longer the woman who had collapsed on the floor of her own courtroom, no longer the victim of his arrogant display of power. Today, she was something else entirely. She was the storm that had come for him, the force that had ripped apart the illusion of invincibility he had lived under for years. The world had watched her fall, but now it was watching her rise. The trial had unfolded for days, each revelation more damning than the last. Miller had thought he was only facing repercussions for what he had done to Danielle, but he had been wrong. The attack in the courtroom had only been the spark that ignited the firestorm, and now that fire had engulfed him completely. The prosecution had been relentless. Eric Vaughn, the federal prosecutor, had spent weeks unearthing the truth. Documents that had been buried, files that had been lost, reports that had been rewritten to protect Miller and men like him. One by one, the evidence was laid bare. Body cam footage that had been tampered with, complaints that had mysteriously disappeared before ever reaching internal affairs, surveillance footage showing Miller brutalizing suspects, knowing full well that nothing would ever come of it. And then, the witnesses, the ones who had once been too afraid to speak. Now, they were stepping into the light. Their voices trembled, but they didn't break. They told their stories, stories of fear, of pain, of abuse that had gone unchecked for years. And Miller, for the first time, had to listen. The final witness approached the stand. A young man, barely in his 20s. He walked with a limp. A visible scar stretched across his cheek. He carried himself with the kind of strength that only came from surviving something that was meant to break you. He took his seat, adjusted the microphone, and then he spoke. He told the courtroom about the night Miller had pulled him over, about how routine had quickly turned into terror, how he had been dragged out of his car, thrown onto the pavement, how Miller had pressed a knee into his back, ignoring his cries, ignoring his pleas. The pressure had been so intense that for a terrifying moment he had thought that was where his life would end. And then he told them the worst part. Miller had laughed as he tightened the cuffs too hard, laughed as he shoved him into the back of the squad car, laughed as he told him, "No one's going to believe you." The young man's voice didn't shake as he finished his testimony. He looked directly at Miller. His eyes burned with something that wasn't quite anger, but wasn't forgiveness either. The courtroom was silent. And then the prosecutor spoke. "Officer Miller," his voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Do you have anything to say?" Miller clenched his jaw. For days, he had sat there, waiting for the moment he would find a way out. He had walked away from worse. He had seen fellow officers escape charges. He had seen the system protect men like him, time and time again. But this time, he felt the weight of every eye in the room pressing down on him. Every camera recording his downfall. Every victim finally standing on the other side of justice, watching him crumble. His lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently in his ear, "Don't say anything. Don't react. We can fight this." Miller didn't hear him. His pulse was pounding in his ears. His hands were clenched into fists. For the first time in his life, he had no words. And for the first time in his life, he understood what it felt like to be powerless. The prosecutor turned back to Judge Carter. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady, "the prosecution rests." Danielle didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She had spent years watching men like Miller walk away. But today was different. Because today, Jason Miller wasn't walking away. Today, Jason Miller was falling. The courtroom had never been this silent. Not during the opening statements, not during the testimonies, not even when the video of Miller's attack on Danielle had played in front of the world. But now, as the weight of everything finally settled on the man who had spent years using fear as a weapon, the silence was suffocating. Jason Miller sat stiffly in his seat. His hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He was still processing what had just happened, what had just been laid bare for the entire world to see. The prosecution had finished. The case against him had been built so carefully, brick by brick. Every piece of evidence laid out with such precision that even the most corrupt system would struggle to twist it in his favor. And now, with the world watching, there was nowhere left to run. Danielle watched him closely. Her expression was unreadable, but Miller could feel her eyes on him, could feel the weight of his own actions pressing down on him. It was a foreign feeling, unfamiliar, uncomfortable. He had never been the one in this position before. He had never been the one expected to answer for what he had done. His lawyer leaned in again, whispering urgently, "We still have options. We can take a plea. We can push for a deal. If you cooperate—" Miller shook his head, jaw tightening. "No." His voice was low, firm, but there was an edge to it that hadn't been there before. "No deals." The lawyer's face tensed. "Jason, listen to me. You don't have a choice anymore. They have everything. The documents, the testimonies, the footage. If you fight this, they will bury you." Miller exhaled slowly. His gaze locked on the polished wood of the table before him. His mind was racing, searching for a way out. Some loophole, some angle, some lifeline. But there was none. For the first time, the walls were closing in on him, and there was no escape. Then, the judge spoke. "Mr. Miller, do you have anything to say before we proceed?" The room turned to him. For a long moment, he didn't move. His lawyer nudged him slightly, urging him to speak, to say something, anything that might soften the blow. But Jason Miller wasn't a man who begged. He wasn't a man who admitted defeat. Slowly, he lifted his head. His eyes locked onto Danielle's. "You think you won?" His voice was hoarse, almost bitter. "You think this changes anything?" A murmur rippled through the crowd, but Danielle didn't react. She simply held his gaze, steady, unshaken. Miller let out a breath, shaking his head. "This system, it was built for men like me." He exhaled sharply. "You really think putting me in cuffs changes that?" Danielle finally leaned forward, resting her hands on the bench. Her voice was calm, measured, but there was something in it that sent a chill down his spine. "You're right about one thing, Miller." Her eyes narrowed. "This system was built for men like you." She let the words linger. "But that's exactly why you're sitting in that chair right now." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, settling over everyone in the room. Miller swallowed hard, but he forced a smirk onto his face, as if he could still pretend that none of this mattered. The prosecutor stepped forward again, his voice slicing through the thick tension like a blade. "Mr. Miller, you speak as if this is just about you, but it's not. This is about every person who has ever suffered at the hands of men like you. Every report that was buried, every witness too afraid to speak, every family that has mourned the loss of someone they should have been able to trust." Miller let out a slow, heavy breath. The prosecutor's voice didn't waver. "For years, you have hidden behind your badge, behind the protection of a system that allowed you to operate without consequence. But today, that ends." The room was silent again. the weight of those words pressing down on Miller like an anvil. He clenched his jaw. "And what?" Miller scoffed. "You think putting me away fixes everything? You think one trial undoes it all?" Danielle finally spoke again, her voice quiet, but powerful. "No." She let the words settle. "But it's a start." Miller let out a breath, his shoulders tensing. The judge turned to the prosecutor. "Is the prosecution prepared to move forward?" "Yes, Your Honor," he replied. "We request that the court move to sentencing immediately." Miller's lawyer stood quickly. "Your Honor, we request a delay in sentencing." But the judge cut him off. "Denied." Her voice was firm, unwavering. "This court sees no reason to delay justice any further." Miller's breathing grew shallow. This was it. There was no out, no last-minute save, no powerful friend to sweep in and make it all disappear. For the first time in his life, he was truly alone. The judge took a deep breath, glanced down at the papers in front of her. Then she looked up. Her eyes met his. One final time. "Jason Miller, you have been found guilty on all counts. The court hereby sentences you to—" The sound of the gavel hitting the wood rang through the air. Final. Absolute. And in that moment, as the reality of it all crashed down on him, Jason Miller realized something terrifying. He was never getting out of this. Not this time. What do you think? Was this justice? Or just another moment in a cycle that always finds a way to reset? Let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed this powerful story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next twist-filled tale. Thank you for watching. Blast off.